Hi everyone, we're going to continue this series of videos on the Scotch Gambit from Black's point of view. So let's recall the beginning moves: e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, d4. So that's the Scotch game. Black should take the pawn, and then instead of recovering it, White plays bishop to c4, and that's the Scotch Gambit. So here Black should play knight f6, attacking the e-pawn. The e-pawn pushes forward and attacks the knight. Black counterattacks the bishop on c4, and the bishop moves to b5 and pins our knight, and now the black knight on f6 has to save itself, and the best square for it is on e4. So now White takes the pawn on d4 and puts pressure on the c6 square. Now in the main line, the move was bishop to d7 to protect c6 and break that pin. But there's another interesting alternative for Black that you can try if you want to potentially take your opponent out of their preparation, and it can lead to some sharp positions. So if you want some counter-attacking chances and you want to inject some tactics into the position, then you can try this move. It's bishop to c5. So you're just ignoring the threat on the c6 square, and the point is, if this knight on d4 ever moves out of the way, then you always have the move bishop takes f2. Okay, so here we'll look at 4 different responses by White. Well, we'll look at both captures on c6 first. Let's take a look at knight takes c6. Okay, if knight takes c6, then we'll follow through with our idea of bishop takes f2 check. Now the king doesn't want to come up to e2. It turns out to be good for Black to play bishop to g4 check. So instead it'll move to f1. Okay, then we'll take the knight, restoring the material, and if White takes the pawn and calls check, then we have to remember a very important key move here. We don't want to block the check with our bishop. This bishop has a much better purpose. It wants to go to a6 and check that king. Notice that king is short on squares. So for that reason, Black should play king to f8. And here, White cannot take the rook because of bishop to a6 check, and that forces the white queen to block either on e2 or d3, and Black wins the queen and wins the game. So instead of taking the rook, White can try some move that counters this threat of bishop to a6, and a common move here is queen to d3. So that stops bishop to a6. Well, we can still have a little fun after queen to d3, so just a sample line, bishop to f5, leaving the rook there for another move, and the point is Black is threatening knight to g3 check with a discovered attack on the queen. So the queen has to move, and a good square might be f3 because that attacks our bishop. And our rook is still under attack, so Black looks like he's in a bit of trouble. But there's a nice saving move, which is bishop to d7. And the point here is, again, White can't take the rook because then our bishop gets back to this diagonal and checks the king and forces the queen to block. And so Black would win. So the position is a little unclear here. White can't take the rook. White can exchange bishops if he wants to. It's a bit of a mess. The kings are on f1 and f8. And the engine assesses it as about equal chances for both sides. So it's pretty interesting. All right, so going back to our key position right here after bishop to c5, let's look at the other capture on c6. What if White captures with the bishop and calls check? Well, then Black has to recapture, of course, to get out of check. And now I'll point out that White definitely cannot take the pawn because bishop takes f2 check comes, and if the king comes forward, then we skewer the queen, win the queen, and if the king goes over here, then we have this move again, bishop to a6 check, and the queen has to block. The pawn could block first, I suppose, but then the queen would have to block after that. So Black is winning. So here, after capturing with the bishop, White cannot follow it up by capturing the pawn with the knight. So what should white do? Well, a common move would be bishop to e3 to support the knight and guard along this diagonal. And after bishop e3, it's not as sharp of a game. I would recommend retreating the bishop to b6. There are other moves you can make, but this is like what we did in the main line with the idea of pushing the pawn to c5 and then pushing the pawn to d4 and expanding in the center, gaining a couple of tempi on white's minor pieces. Okay, so going back, another move we should consider is bishop to e3 right away. I mean, why should white voluntarily give up the bishop pair if they're only going to play bishop to e3 afterwards? So most likely white would play bishop to e3 in this position right away. And so that stops any bishop takes f2 check ideas. Okay, so what should black do here? Well, you can get on with development and castle, ignoring the threat on c6. There's still two pieces attacking the c6 square. White can try to take, like knight takes c6, and then b takes c6, but white has to be very careful here. Okay, it would be a mistake for white to take on c6 again and attack the rook. And the reason that's a blunder is because black has bishop takes e3. And so black is threatening bishop takes f2 check, followed by bishop to a6 again. So white has nothing better than to take the bishop. But then there's this common tactic, I'm sure you're aware of this, especially if you play a lot of puzzles online, queen to h4 check. Okay, so the king can't come up here, this check is devastating, so white has to block, but then the knight takes the pawn, and the h-pawn is pinned, although white has nothing better than to take the knight and give up the exchange, and the position is crushing for black. Black is just winning here. Okay, so that's why white cannot take this pawn and threaten the rook. So instead, what white should do is take our bishop on c5. So get rid of that dark square bishop, which was harassing white on the f2 square. And then black should take back the bishop on c5. And now white can take on c6, now that the dark square bishops are gone. Okay, and here we'll just play rook to b8. And we do have some compensation for the pawn we've lost in this opening. Black has developed a little bit better. There's pressure on the b file. The rook is really nicely placed. This pawn is under attack, but black is still doing okay. The engine assesses the position as all zeros. Okay, so going back, there's one more move I wanted to look at after bishop to c5. So we looked at both captures on c6, and we looked at bishop to e3. Another sensible move white can try is castles. Well, if castles, we will castle. Okay, and now we've left c6 up for grabs again. So white may try to take, like knight takes c6, b takes c6, bishop takes c6, and white reasons it's okay this time because I'm castled and my rook is defending the f2 square. Well, a great way for black to play here is not passively by saving the rook, but black should play actively with bishop to a6, counterattacking the white rook. So both rooks are hanging here. Well, white doesn't want to move the rook and face bishop takes f2. White also doesn't want to really lose that rook, which is defending the f2 square, so white doesn't want to trade rooks. Turns out the best move for white is queen takes d5. So just leaving both rooks hanging for now and attacking that knight on e4. Well, this position actually favors black, and there are some dangers in the position. I would recommend taking the rook on f1, and here, there's a little danger. If white takes our rook in return, then white's losing to this beautiful move, bishop to c4, attacking the queen. The reason white's losing here is because his back rank is weak. He can't take this knight or this bishop because there's a a mate here on d1. So white is actually forced to trade queens, but then our rook comes to the d file and threatens mate, and is threatening that bishop at the same time. So after white defends the mate, then black takes the bishop on a8, and black's up a whole piece. So black's winning in this position. Okay, so after black takes the rook here, white cannot take the rook back. So what white has to do is take the knight on e4 and just play down an exchange. White does have a couple of pawns for the exchange. Okay, here black needs to do something about their bishop on f1. And a good move is bishop to b5, attacking that bishop which was threatening the rook. And again, releasing a mate threat here on d1. In fact, if white takes the rook, which one of my opponents did in a recent blitz game, then black will be very happy to mate here. White can block for one move, but there's a mate. Okay, so black can't take that rook. So instead, what if black takes the bishop? Well, that still allows queen to d1 check, or rather white takes the bishop, not black takes the bishop, and then white blocks. Well, then black takes the bishop on c1, and black is still up in exchange and has a dominating position. The engine scores this as -5.2. So white really shouldn't try that either. So what white should do is defend the d1 square with the move knight to c3. Okay, just develop and defend that d1 square. So after knight to c3, black will exchange that bishop which was attacking the rook, and then maybe save his bishop by moving it to d4. And the game would continue from here with a slight edge to black because black has the exchange. White does have a couple pawns in compensation, but I think black has the initiative in the position. So I'd rather be black here. Okay, so those are the options I wanted to consider after this very interesting move bishop to c5 that takes us out of the main line. All right, thanks for watching the video.